Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for attending. I think I speak for everyone here about how exciting it is to be able to finally meet in the Parish Life Center now. Also excited to be able to have Father Travis Stevens here with us tonight. The title of his presentation is Benemortasia, the Ethics of Dying Well. Benemortasia, think euthanasia. It's a big Benemortasia. Benemortasia if you're Italian. Think euthanasia, the ethics of dying well. It's a big word, but who knows? It may be slipping into your conversations the next few weeks after tonight's presentation. Who knows? End of life issues, especially in these times, involve custom, reason, belief, science, the law, money, fear, and love. I think Father Stevens is extremely well suited to discuss these issues. Among his degrees are some in biology, biochemistry, philosophy, theology. He has a PhD in healthcare ethics, but probably most importantly, he has the influence of the Holy Spirit as a Roman Catholic priest. So please join me in welcoming Father Travis Stevens.
Thank you, guys. So I spoke to the chair of the theology department at Marian, and he said, he told me that Jim was looking for a speaker on ethics and end-of-life care and stuff. And then he said, well, just why don't you go next door to St. Alphonsus Liguori? You have Father Travis Stevens. He has a PhD in healthcare ethics. He teaches bioethics at the university. So it's perfect just to redirect to somebody who is local in the diocese. So I do teach at Marian University a number of classes, moral theology, bioethics. This semester, I'm teaching a course on the catechism to the seminarians at Brute Seminary. We're going through the entire catechism from front to back. And then next semester, I'm really excited because I'm going to be teaching a class on the theology of Dostoevsky. So I don't know if any of you have read Dostoevsky, but he is a Russian author, and he wrote Crime and Punishment. That's probably Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov are the two books that he's most famous for having written. I wanted to start off with an image from Crime and Punishment for our talk tonight. In the book, the main character, Rajion Raskolnikov, he is a murderer. He kills somebody, a pawn shop broker, and her sister. And the thing about Dostoevsky is that he is a psychologist of the 19th century. And one of the things that he's most famous for is having really been able to, on a theological and psychological level, anticipate many of the crises that we see take place in the 20th century and even in the 21st century. And one of the things that he is aware of about the human person is the complexity of the human person, that each and every individual, no matter who they are, has the capacity for great evil on the one hand and for great good on the other hand. So Raskolnikov, having killed this woman and her sister, visits the site, and on his way home, he runs into a person that he had met in a bar a few weeks prior. And this person had been hit by a horse carriage. He was drunk, he was walking in the middle of the street, and he suddenly got hit by a horse carriage. And he knew this guy, and he felt great empathy for him. And he picked this guy up with some other people around him and brought him back to his home because he was the only person who actually knew where he was from. He brings him into the house where his wife, Katerina, and his children, his stepchildren are there. And he is simply present. There's nothing that can be done for this guy. They try to call the doctor, they call the priest, they come and they anoint him. And before he leaves, and after this guy Marmeladov dies, Raskolnikov leaves 25 rubles, all the money he has, with Katerina to bury her husband and to be able to a certain extent, honor her husband with a meal. As I've reflected on that story, what stands out to me is that this is a beautiful image of the Good Samaritan. And as we reflect, if you were to reflect on the rest of that book of Crime and Punishment, it literally has every type of death that a person can experience. On the one hand, you have homicide, you have death by accident, death by natural causes, and even death by suicide. So every type of death is depicted, and the different experiences of accompaniment in death is something that you experience in that book. When we reflect on the Good Samaritan is a scripture passage that the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, uses as a reflection on end-of-life care, particularly a reflection on why the church stands against euthanasia, but not just why the church is against it, but how can we accompany people with a good death? It's a great document. This document, it's called Samaritanos Bonus, the Good Samaritan in Latin. So it's a document that actually just came out in 2020. And perhaps it's quite appropriate that just as we began a pandemic, that we have this book that reflects on dying well and the role of an accompaniment that we are all called to for those who are dying. And this is exactly what the church teaches about the end of life, that the church starts in general by pointing out that the dignity of the human person is an inviolable dignity. Every human person is created in the image and likeness of God. Having been created in the image and likeness of God, there is an inviolable dignity associated with every human person. But not only is there an inviolable dignity associated with every human person because we've been created in the image and likeness of God, but because we have been redeemed by Jesus Christ. And there is, on the one hand, having been created in God's image and likeness, we also stand in a state of longing. And that longing is for the infinite. It's for the divine. And we anticipate being able to enter into a relationship with the eternal. This is something that Samaritanos Bonus speaks of, is that invitation, that anticipation of being able to enter into relationship with the divine. The dignity of the human person is the foundation for all the moral teachings of the church. Particularly, it is foundational for end-of-life care. It's also foundational for the beginning of life care. The inviolability of the human person means that we can never take another person's life. And it means that we are called at the end of life to accompany people in their suffering. Now, if we're to reflect on death, and I think it's important for us to reflect on death, one of the things that we do is we reflect on the 4 last things. Last week, I taught 4 last things to the seminarians. I said this used to be a custom in our daily life to take some time and reflect on these 4 last things. And what are the 4 last things? Death, judgment, heaven, hell. To reflect on the 4 last things is to prepare ourselves for our own ultimate demise. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, says that death is the greatest affront to the dignity of the human person. When a person dies, the soul is separated from the body, and it is indeed the person that dies. Catholic Christian anthropology teaches us that the human person is a body-soul composite. That means that when we die and our soul is separated from our body and our body deteriorates, decays, the person is dead. The soul, we believe, is sempiternal. Once created, it exists ad infinitum, forever. But we anticipate a bodily resurrection, so that even if we experience the beatific vision after death, that is heaven, there's still something that's a little bit incomplete. We're still awaiting a final resurrection when the body will be reunited with the soul, an incorrupt body, not the same body that is corrupt, but an incorrupt body is what we anticipate in the resurrection. Healthcare workers are called to cure. Everything about what they do is oriented towards helping people reattain good health. So to suggest that medicine could be about anything other than curing is a challenge to contemporary medicine. It is a challenge because the ultimate goal seems to be in medicine to either cure or to relieve a person of their pain and the accompanying suffering associated with the pain. Well, we can't always do that. We're always called to care, but we can't always cure. So what are we called to do in the face of the suffering that people experience, perhaps at the end of their life? And really, our world tells us that suffering is an evil that should be avoided at all cost. The inclination towards individualism that we see manifest in our society is such that our inclination is to exalt and hold up autonomy as the most important of all ethical values. Autonomy being freedom and the right to choose, the right to determine our own end. And when it comes to the end of life, if suffering is considered to be an evil and autonomy is the most important value, then why not end our suffering by choosing death and ending our life? Well, this is exactly what euthanasia is. It is the choice to end suffering by ending one's life. That's what euthanasia is. And it can be an act of omission as much as an act of commission. In other words, it can be an act that is overtly a choice to end one's life, or it may be an act of neglect, where we simply omit treatment and say, we're not going to provide care. We're not going to provide medicinal treatment for this condition and allow this person to die. But there are times when the choice to forgo treatment is morally permissible. Not only morally permissible, but morally praiseworthy. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, when is that? When does that occur? When is it a choice to forgo treatment versus a choice to euthanize oneself or another? Okay, let's just step back for a little bit. An ethics lesson. There is a difference, obviously, between euthanasia and assisted suicide. The difference, of course, is in the person, the agent, who has agency. And when it comes to euthanasia, the agency is in the healthcare worker. When it comes to assisted suicide, the agency, the principal agency, is in the patient, but the role of cooperator is in the healthcare worker if we're talking about assisted suicide, okay? So in many ways, the same ethics that apply to euthanasia apply to assisted suicide. But the difference being in euthanasia, the principal agent of the moral act is the healthcare worker, the physician, whereas in assisted suicide, the principal agent is the patient, him or herself. Okay. So what is it that we as Catholic Christians are called to at the end of life? Principally, and above all, we are called to the role of accompaniment. Samaritanus Bonus describes this accompaniment as a contemplative gaze. This is what John Paul II actually also describes it as. It is to see the dignity of the other person and to be able to contemplate the beauty of that other person and to realize their uniqueness as a human person and to respect them in their dignity and to uphold the dignity of those people and to be able to enter into relationship with them in an empathetic way. This is a really central point of Samaritanus Bonus, the contemplative gaze, which we are called to have with regard to those who are dying. Accompaniment. This is what we're called to in particular. And whenever we see a call by a patient to be euthanized or the call by a patient for physician or assisted suicide, this call may be a call for help. It's a call for recognition of one's own dignity. It's a call to be seen as a person of value and a person of worth. So we talked a little bit about the dignity of the human person, our understanding of death, and another thing, we've also talked about euthanasia and assisted suicide. But there are times when we have to recognize the fact that death is an inevitability. And as Catholic Christians, death is not something that we can avoid or even should avoid at all cost. There is a time in our life when we have to simply accept the reality of death with an openness and a hope and faith in the future resurrection. So that being said, in healthcare ethics, we make a distinction between treatment that is extraordinary means of treatment and ordinary means of treatment. Another way of describing this is proportionate and disproportionate. So extraordinary means and disproportionate means are the same thing. Ordinary means of treatment and proportionate means of treatment are the same thing. How do we describe what constitutes ordinary means versus extraordinary means? Well, the answer is it's quite relative, but the relativity is on the part of the patient. So it's up to the patient to find that. There are two words that we use to describe treatment that is extraordinary means. One is futile, the other is burdensome. So these two words, if the treatment, according to the perspective of the patient, is considered to be either futile or excessively burdensome, one may consider that treatment extraordinary means. An extraordinary means of treatment or disproportionate means of treatment is a form of treatment that one is free to either receive or forego. It is possible to forego disproportionate means of treatment or extraordinary means of treatment. So when I say that we look at this from the perspective of the patient, it may be that the patient is incapacitated and it's not ultimately it's not the decision of the patient, but it's the decision of the healthcare power of attorney, the individual who makes the decision on the part of the patient. So it's important that we share our wishes, our desires, our expectations with a loved one whom we appoint as our healthcare power of attorney. Now, another important thing to think about is that this is the way that things normally happen. There's no normal, of course, but if we're talking about the end of life, the truth is that it's a progressive thing. It may be that at one point in our life, we're diagnosed with a chronic condition, or we're diagnosed with potentially terminal illness. It may be that this illness can be treated. It may be that our life can be extended to a certain extent. The quality of life may be questionable, but it's possible perhaps to extend one's life. But at the end of the day, we're all going to die. And it may be that it is generally the case that as illnesses progress, the condition of the individual patient deteriorates. And as that individual patient's condition deteriorates, what at the beginning of the illness may have been considered ordinary means of treatment may at a later point in time be considered extraordinary means of treatment. So there's a lot of relativity here, right? And I don't mean relativity in an absolute sense. I mean relativity in the sense that it really does depend on the perspective of the patient. One of the reasons that healthcare ethicists have a job is because in healthcare ethics, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of need to be able to discern where the values are and to discern how to resolve ethical dilemmas and helping people to see with clarity potential solutions to problems. So, we live in a society today, needless to say, where euthanasia or assisted suicide is permissible. And this document, Samaritanus Bonus, is really a wonderful document. And in preparation for this class, this talk tonight, I read through that document, and it's really a wonderful document. And I think that one of the things that it addresses is the philosophy of the culture of death that John Paul II speaks of, Pope Francis speaks of, Pope Benedict speaks of this as well, versus a culture of life. And the reality is that our life is not in isolation. We don't live our life in isolation, and we don't die in isolation. And none of us wants to die in isolation, if we're honest with ourselves. We want that accompaniment. We want to be able to point to our life and say, this is what was important to me. This is what was of value. And to be able to discern and work through some of the difficulties and challenges in our life. One of the things that there's really two documents on end-of-life care in the Catholic Church. The first document, which I didn't even talk about yet, is the Declaration on Euthanasia, written by the CDF in 1980. The second document is the Samaritanus Bonus, which is a much longer document, and I think a much better written, much more interesting document in terms of going into the great depth of exploring this concept of accompaniment and all the different potential avenues and things that we can talk about. The Declaration on Euthanasia was written in 1980, and it's kind of a direct response to the question of euthanasia itself. And it also addresses this question of the use of analgesic painkillers at the end of life, and whether or not these can be used, how they can be used, and whether or not maybe we should step back from using them with as much enthusiasm as we might otherwise choose. So, with that reflection, they use the principle of double effect to address this. So, double effect, we've already talked about one of the most foundational principles in ethics. That's the imago Dei is what we call it, the dignity of the human person having been created in the image and likeness of God. But another important principle in healthcare ethics in particular, probably one of the most important principles, is the principle of double effect. So what is the principle of double effect? Thomas Aquinas develops it in the Summa Theologica with a realization that sometimes a single act can have more than one effect. One effect may be intended, and the other effect may not be intended. St. Thomas Aquinas uses this principle of double effect to explain how it is possible that one may kill another person in self-defense, not intentionally, right? So what he argues is that as we reflect on an act, we must first identify the object of the act, what it is that the person is actually doing. In the case of self-defense, the act is one of self-defense. You're protecting yourself from harm. And then you have to look at what is the intention of the act. Well, in that case, the act of self-defense, maybe physically it's an act that causes death, but morally it's an act of protection, and its intention is to protect oneself or others from being injured. Then you have to consider the consequences of those acts. The consequence is that your life is saved. Unfortunately, if you use lethal self-defense, the assailant is killed and dies. Moral theologians throughout the history of the church use this principle of double effect to defend the possibility of doing many different acts. Well, it's the use of this principle of double effect that they defend the possibility of using analgesic narcotic painkillers at the end of life. It may be that as a person at the end of life is really struggling with pain. Sometimes pain is a part of death. And as a result of that, it may be that it's necessary to use a titration of painkillers. Unfortunately, the unintended consequence of that is that respiration is reduced. We know that if a person, I mean, look around in the world today, all the people dying of opiate use disorder, right? All these people dying of fentanyl abuse. Well, we know that these are very deadly drugs. We know that it may, in fact, hasten death, bring about death more quickly. The principle of double effect enables us to use narcotic painkillers at the end of life to reduce a person's pain, even though we may in fact know that it is going to hasten death. Of course, the CDF cautions us in this because at the end of life, we ought to be spiritually aware of what it is that we are preparing ourselves for, which is to meet God. And if we are called to be spiritually aware, then we ought not to be rendered unconscious. So, on the one hand, we have this tension that we want to relieve a person of their pain and suffering, but on the other hand, we want to keep a sense of consciousness so that they can prepare themselves spiritually and mentally for their encounter with the Lord in their own personal judgment. And at the same time, in the Catholic Christian world, we believe in redemptive suffering, which is to say that our suffering can have meaning. It can be valuable. It's not something to be avoided at all cost. Now, this document, Declaration on Euthanasia, says that no one is necessarily forced to accept heroic suffering at the end of life, but some people may choose to forego analgesic painkillers for the sake of being able to offer up that suffering in a redemptive way as a prayer. And of course, we don't force that upon anybody, but we are nonetheless called to the best of our ability to be conscious, at least as long as we can, so that we can receive the sacraments in anticipation of our own death and demise. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions, comments. Any thoughts? Yep. It does not. So hospice, okay, good question. And I believe Natalie King is going to speak on palliative care. So when we think about palliative care, we understand palliative care to be a continuum. And what does it mean? It essentially means comfort, helping people to address the pain and suffering associated with medicinal treatment. At the beginning of an illness, palliative care should start too. And it may be the palliative care at the beginning of an illness before pain is a big part of the suffering that we may be experiencing, that it takes a small role. But as we go along in our treatment, and perhaps we come to a point where we realize that our condition is terminal, it may be that the greater focus is less on curing the condition and more on treating the pain, so that the palliative role takes a greater precedence. The difference between regular care and hospice care is this. Hospice care is a realization that this person, this individual, is terminal, but it doesn't mean that you don't care for the person. And in fact, we're always called to care for the person. And that care may look different based on where that person is in the process of dying. But if a person is in hospice, that individual understands that they're not going to do anything life-saving. So they're not going to be taking antibiotics. If they get really, really ill, they're not going to run off to the emergency room to try to do any curative measures or any measures that would basically prevent death. So it's not a bad thing. Hospice is a good thing. Right. Right. Yeah. So sometimes if a patient is in pain, they may do like a titration of morphine and Ativan, particularly if they're struggling with breathing. Uh, and it's a way of giving them, helping them to be comfortable at the end. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, take the same amount, if they make 2 visits over 2 days, 3 visits over a month.
Okay.
And so the problem is, nature being what it is.
Yeah.
Many stories about somebody that you thought was gonna be around for a week or two, gone within 24 hours of hospice. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard of that a lot. Hmm. Anybody know the answer to that? It's 8 right now, 8 states. Yeah. It's not, it's assisted suicide is what it is, but yeah. No, Indiana does not have an assisted suicide or euthanasia, right? Hmm.
As Catholics, are we categorically opposed to all forms of euthanasia and suicide?
Yes. As Catholics, we are categorically opposed to all forms of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So, yeah. Yep. So then okay. So this is a question about artificial nutrition and hydration. So that became really a controversial issue in the Catholic world because of the Terry Schiavo situation and the church's response to that particular question. And when the church responded to that particular question, it was essentially a very narrow place, and it had to do with those who were in a uh, vegetative state, okay, minimally conscious state. So it was a question of whether or not artificial nutrition and hydration could be considered extraordinary means of care in individuals who are in a vegetative state or a minimally conscious state. And the answer to that question is it's not extraordinary means of care, but it's ordinary means of care. Now, if we're talking about at the end of life, our organs begin to shut down. And part of our organs shutting down is it's a process that is progressive. At some point, our digestive system no longer functions. And it doesn't help for us to administer nutrition and hydration, artificial or otherwise, if a person is no longer able to metabolize or assimilate that nutrition and hydration. So clearly in circumstances like that, the withdrawal of artificial nutrition and hydration is acceptable. Not only is it acceptable, it's medically indicated and it ought not to be administered because the risk of the food backing up into the esophagus and aspirating, getting into the trachea and interrupting breathing is very high. So, yeah. Yes.
Have they defined?
Okay, so the definition of death, there are 2 current working definitions of death. One is the neurological criteria. The other is cardiopulmonary cessation. So, by the way, these are biological definitions of death. The illogical definition of death is, of course, the separation of the soul from the body. The biological definition of death, obviously, we can't have a most precise moment of death, right? Except that what we say is it's irreversible cardiopulmonary cessation or total brain death. Total brain death would include the upper brain and the brain stem. There are tests that can be done, physical exam tests that can be done to confirm whether or not brain stem death has actually occurred. Yes. And both. Yes. That's correct. No. Right. Yeah. So here's the thing. If you're brain dead, one of the tests that they do is called the apneic test. If you're brain dead, truly brain dead, you cannot breathe for yourself. So when you remove ventilation, mechanical ventilation, the person will not try to breathe on their own anymore. So the idea, see, we could have talked all about brain death, right? I mean, in a class in bioethics, I would have a whole class devoted to brain death. No, yeah. Okay, so this is what I would say. There's essentially two sets of ethics that would determine your decision making here. On the one hand, if you're talking about meeting the neurological criteria of death, then the ethics is simple, the individual is dead. But if the individual is not necessarily dead, then the question becomes a question of extraordinary and ordinary means of treatment. Okay. So if an individual, for example, is largely brain dead, but still has an apneic response, but is essentially no manifestation of upper brain function, then the question becomes, with regard to continual mechanical ventilation and artificial nutrition and hydration, is this futile? Is this burdensome? Right? That's the question. So then it becomes a question of extraordinary means versus ordinary means of treatment. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you do. So Catholic hospitals, for example, actually every hospital is going to have a healthcare ethicist, but Catholic hospitals in particular are going to have healthcare ethics consultation that is available that would include either consultation of a healthcare ethics board or consultation of a healthcare ethicist. And so it would just be a matter of telling whoever is at the hospital, we would like to have an ethics consult, and you could have that done. Otherwise, there are like institutions out there, like the National Catholic Bioethics Center has 24/7 ethics consultation that is available. And then, of course, you can always call an ethicist like myself, or this parish, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, you have Elliot Bedford, who is an ethicist. He's at St. Vincent. So, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
To suffering is the consciousness and allowing somebody to have redemptive suffering. At some point, you're going to get to the point that probably not a clear right or wrong, even if you accept the bioethicist. Is it?
I agree.
Discernment is really the last thing you can do, or what would your advice be in approaching that?
I would say that at the end, I mean, yeah, it is prayerful discernment, and every case is different, and it's a matter of making sure that the presumption is that we have good intentions, right? That we want to do what's best. So just having an awareness of the principles is important. I was talking to a priest last night, and he was telling me, I told him I had this presentation today, and he was like, oh yeah, I took healthcare ethics when I was in seminary, and then my dad was on life support and we had to make a decision, and I completely forgot everything. And he had to call like an ethicist, to remind him of all these principles, because it's like you can know this stuff on an intellectual and academic level, but then all of a sudden you're thrown into the midst of it and you have to actually make a decision. And it's kind of like it's a fight or flight type of a thing, right? Particularly if you're really personally very invested in it. It's your parent, or it's your child, or your loved one. Then it's like, okay, wow, this is the decision that I never wanted to have to make. I never thought I would have to make it, but then now I do have to make it. That's why it's helpful just to be able to talk about some of these principles on an academic intellectual level, so that when you're in the midst of it, it's kind of like, oh, I kind of remember that. Yes. And okay, I remember having a conversation with mom or dad and them saying, yeah, I don't really want to be put on life support for the rest of my life. And maybe I would like to be, I want to be made comfortable at this point. So these are conversations. How do we make the best decisions in the moment? We have those conversations ahead of time. And you actually have a specific person in your family or among your loved ones that has that role and job of being your healthcare power of attorney. Yep. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's wonderful. The Indiana Catholic, is it Indiana Catholic Conference, ICC, Indiana Catholic Conference, they have a form that if you call them up, they'll just send you that form. And it's, I don't know, it's about 5 pages and you can read through that and it helps you to really essentially make end of life decisions, but most importantly, to appoint a healthcare power of attorney, which is really the best advice. I would say at the end of life, the best thing that you could do, the best choice, rather than filling out a living will, having a healthcare power of attorney is the best decision. Because here's the thing, you can have a living will, but there's always going to be ambiguity. And healthcare workers are always going to go to a healthcare power of attorney before they look at a living will, right? So they'd rather talk to a person before they would like to look at a piece of paper or, you know, several pages of notes. Yep. Great question. So they did just recently change the law so that, yes, now there actually is a hierarchy, whereas before there was not a hierarchy. So now that there is a hierarchy, and the hierarchy starts with your spouse. And then if you don't have a spouse, then I guess it would go to your parent and then your children and things like that. So there is a legal hierarchy now. Yeah. I would probably say I would rather not do that. uh, wow. No, it's okay. I mean, it's just that I can totally imagine that would happen. And then, wow, you well, okay. So here's the thing. This clearly is something that can happen even in Catholic healthcare institutions, right? It may be that somebody's requesting something that is not medically indicated, or that they're requesting something that is not ethically indicated or permissible. And so in a situation like that, as either a healthcare institution or as an individual who is a healthcare power of attorney, uh, we're going to do our best to choose to make choices that are in conformity with ethics. So it would be my hope.
What kind of?
Well, Catholic Christian ethics. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you end up well, not so much in Indiana, but if you were, you know, in Colorado where assisted suicide is permissible and you are the healthcare power of attorney and that patient's requesting assisted suicide, that puts you in a really precarious spot, I would say. Of course, I suppose, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you can decline being a power of attorney, in which case it would default to another individual. So, yeah. I mean, if you said, that's why it's probably advisable to have multiple people in a hierarchy there. So, like my mom, I believe, has my brother as the healthcare power of attorney because he's a physician, but he lives in Florida, you know, and I live in Indiana and she lives in Indiana. Who's going to be making these decisions? in all likelihood, right? Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. That's good. So that's good. That's good legal practice too. Yeah. That's good to know. I didn't know that. I'm not that surprised by that. Yeah, yeah. That's good to know. There you go. Yeah, yeah. Right. There you go. I like that. Yep. Okay. DNR. So, well, okay. Great question. So sometimes people, okay, a DNR is a do not resuscitate. And DNRs are appropriate at the end of life when you have a terminal condition. Um, if you're not at the end of life, you don't have a terminal condition, then you probably shouldn't have a DNR. Now, I'm sorry, I laugh at that because honestly, if you're 90 years old, that's a terminal condition, right? Now, but I mean, at some point, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. At some point, though, I mean, we realize that, like, it doesn't make sense to do CPR, right? Okay, I'm sorry. So yeah, I mean, at some point in our where we're at in our life, we're gonna have to say, okay, do I want CPR or not? Okay, and it's appropriate to have like a DNR. So could that be? I mean, it could be that you're terminally ill and you're 41 years old like me, and you say, I'm gonna die, and this is futile. So it's just like any other treatment. Is this futile and burdensome? Same criteria must be used to assess whether or not this, at times, life-saving treatment is appropriate. And then I think we even are aware of the fact that as we get older and older, you know, the realization of burdensomeness and futility of CPR gets much higher. And so again, though, that's up to the patient, the perspective of the patient. It's not up to the physician. It's not up to me. It's not up to anybody but that perspective of that patient to decide that. Okay. Yeah.
Excessive.
It depends, but if that person is otherwise healthy, yeah, I mean, that's probably not an advisable thing. If the individual is otherwise healthy, yeah, and you could make an argument that that is, it's an act of omission, right? Yeah. If we forego ordinary treatment, that's an act of omission, and it could be a suicidal act. So, yeah. That put up a lot of hands. Okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's good to know. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. 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 Well, and that's why even in that older document, Declaration on Euthanasia, They make it very clear that it's not something that we impose on the other person. It's a choice that they make. So when they use the word heroic virtue, so that isn't something that we impose, but it is a choice that an individual makes. So that's I haven't read Samaritanus Bonus in detail with that lens on to see what they say about that, but that's an interesting question, and I would want to read through that. And my guess is that they do an even better job of addressing that question than on the Declaration on Euthanasia. That's a good point.
So as a committee, we're just thrilled, obviously, that you're all here. We love doing this every year. We want to keep doing it as much as we can. I think we've got a great lineup this month. So thank you all for being here, and especially thank you to Father Travis. Thank you. As we always do at Catholic events, in order to perpetuate the process, we're going to solicit your help in doing that. For those of you who know the conversion of rubles to US dollars, we would like a little more than 25 rubles, if that's okay. That's about a quarter. So 2,500 rubles would be outstanding, but we'll have people stay for dinner. And no, seriously, anything you can do to help, because that's what allows us to bring in great speakers like this. And clearly it evokes a lot of conversations.
Since we failed to start this evening with a prayer, could we ask?
Yeah, sure.
to bless us with blessing?
Okay, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Merciful Father, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather, to reflect on the important concept of Bene Mortasia. We pray that you will grant to us solemnity as we reflect on the four last things and help us to make good decisions regarding ourselves and our loved ones. We ask that you send forth your Spirit into each of our hearts and that you bless all who are present, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.